Close your eyes if you will, or let them rest somewhere soft in the dim light. Breathe slowly. Let the day fall away like dust settling in a quiet room. Tonight, we are going to travel together, not through the loud, bright corridors of modern memory, but into a much older, warmer, and dustier world. A world of sun-scorched stone, heavy wool, and the distant clatter of hooves on dry earth. We are going to drift back, gently, to the time of the Crusades, but not to the battles, not to the clashing of swords or the cries of war. Tonight, we will look at something quieter, something slower, and in its own way, far more intimate. We will explore how those men in their heavy mail, the knights of the Crusades, managed to survive the very things that threatened to undo them long before any enemy arrow could find its mark. We will speak of the heat that pressed down like a physical weight, the insidious creep of disease that haunted every camp, and the endless, sleepless marches that stretched miles into a bleary haze. And we will do it slowly, as if we are walking beside them on a long path with no need to rush. Imagine for a moment a night from the cool, green hills of northern France or the misty valleys of England. He was used to damp, to fog, to the constant soft drizzle that kept his homeland lush and forgiving. His armor, when it grew warm, was a comfort against the chill. His heavy woolen tunic, meant to be worn in rain and wind, was a second skin against the cold. Now, picture him stepping onto the shores of the Levant in the late 11th or 12th century. The air hits him first. It is not like any air he has known. It is dry, yes, but also thick with heat, like the breath of an oven. The sun, which in his homeland was a shy and distant visitor, here becomes a constant, glaring companion. It bleaches the sky to a pale white. It bakes the ground into cracked, light-colored dust. And the armor that once kept him warm now becomes a trap. The metal, even through the padded gambeson underneath, absorbs the heat and holds it. It becomes a heavy, stifling shell. A knight on foot, or even on horseback, under that midday sun, would feel as if he were walking inside a slowly heating kettle. To understand how they survived, we must first feel the heat with them, not with alarm, but with a kind of patient curiosity. There were no modern sunscreens, no lightweight fabrics, no hydration packs strapped to their belts. They had what they had, and what they had, surprisingly, was a great deal of sensible adaptation, much of it borrowed from the very people they were fighting. The knights learned, after the first painful weeks, to adjust their schedule. The heat of midday was not to be challenged. It was to be endured in stillness. So the marches would begin in the deep, cool hours before dawn, when the stars were still bright, and the world was silent save for the crunch of boots and the soft breathing of horses. They would travel until the sun climbed high enough to cast short, harsh shadows, and then they would stop. They would find whatever shade they could under a sparse tree, against a wall, or simply by erecting a simple cloth shelter, a tent that offered not coolness, but at least a respite from the direct glare. They would wait and rest, and let the hours pass in a drowse. It was a rhythm that felt strange to men used to working through the daylight of a northern summer, but it was a rhythm that saved them. It was a surrender to the environment, not a fight against it. And then there was the matter of what they wore. The heavy wool, thick and dark, seems like a terrible choice for a desert. And yet, in a strange way, it worked. Wool is a natural insulator. It can protect against cold, yes, but in the heat, it also creates a layer of air between the fabric and the skin. It slows the absorption of the sun's heat. It allows sweat to evaporate more slowly, keeping the body cooler than the thin linen that a modern mind might think preferable. The knights often wore a loose, light-colored linen tunic over their armor, a simple adaptation that reflected some of the sun's rays. They wrapped their heads and necks in cloth, a style they saw in the local people, a practice that kept the sun off the nape of the neck and the top of the head, where heat stroke could strike most quickly. It was a simple turban, a scarf, a strip of fabric tied in a practical way, and it made a difference. It was not a matter of style, it was a matter of survival, learned from observation and necessity. They also learned to drink, and to drink often. Water was precious, carried in skins or jars, and they learned to distribute it carefully, to sip rather than gulp, to keep the mouth moist and the body from the deep, trembling fatigue of dehydration. The water itself was often warm, tasting of leather and earth, but it was life. But the heat was only one of the enemies that traveled with them. The other, more silent and more terrifying, was disease. In the camps of the Crusaders, sickness was a constant presence. The crowded conditions, the unfamiliar food, the water that was often unclean, the flies that feasted on everything, all of it conspired to create a perfect environment for illness. Dysentery was a common visitor, a draining, relentless sickness that weakened a man in days. Fevers came and went, sometimes with the shivering of malaria, sometimes with the burning of typhoid. The knights, for all their martial training, were not prepared for this invisible battle. They understood swords and lances. They understood the shock of a charge. But they did not understand the small, crawling world of microbes. They blamed bad air or miasma, the foul vapors that seemed to rise from marshes and latrines. And in a way, they were not entirely wrong. The bad air was often associated with places where there was standing water or rotting filth. So they took what measures they could. They tried to camp on high ground where the air seemed cleaner. They dug latrines, often downwind from the camp, and ordered that men use them, though not always with success. They boiled water when they could, not knowing that boiling killed germs, but knowing that water that had been boiled seemed safer, less likely to cause the griping pains in the belly. They used herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, and lavender, familiar from their gardens at home, were used to scent the air, to mask the smell of sickness, and perhaps, in their minds, to ward off the evil humors. They chewed on certain roots and seeds, and they made poultices for wounds and sores. The medicine of the time was a blend of ancient wisdom, church teaching, and hopeful superstition. A knight who fell ill might be bled to let the bad humors escape. He might be given a potion of crushed gemstones or powdered unicorn horn, if such things could be found. He might be prayed over and given a relic to touch. And sometimes, perhaps often, the simple act of rest, of drinking clean water, and of being cared for by a companion was enough to let the body heal itself. The survival rate was not high, but it was present. The knights who lived through the sieges and the marches were often those who had a basic, stubborn strength and a bit of luck. They were the ones who, in the face of a fever that could have taken them, simply refused or were spared by chance. And then there were the sleepless marches, the long, exhausting journeys that took them from the coast to the inland cities, from one battlefield to the next, over mountains and through valleys, under a sun that did not relent. These marches were not the orderly, quick movements of a modern army. They were slow, ponderous columns of men, horses, pack animals, and wagons. They moved at the pace of the slowest, and the slowest was often a man who was half asleep on his feet. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion. The nights were short or filled with alarms. The threat of attack meant that sentries had to be posted, and even when a knight was not on watch, he could not sleep easily. The ground was hard, the air was cold after the sun set, and the sounds of the night were unfamiliar. The howl of a jackal, the cry of a night bird, the distant sound of a horse shifting in the dark, all of it kept the mind alert, restless. And then, when dawn came, it was time to march again. They marched in a state that we might call a walking trance. The body moved, one foot in front of the other, but the mind drifted. Men would fall asleep in the saddle, and only the motion of the horse kept them from toppling off. They would wake with a start, grasping at the pommel, and then settle back into the rhythm. On foot, the march was a monotony of dust and heat. The same landscape, the same dry hills, the same patches of scrub, the same crunch of gravel under boots, the same weight of armor pressing on the shoulders, the same thirst. To survive these marches, the knights relied on a kind of internal discipline. They learned to compartmentalize, to focus only on the next step, the next breath, the next mile. They sang, sometimes, or chanted psalms, the rhythm of the words matching the rhythm of the march. They told stories, passed down the line, of home, of past battles, of the saints. These stories were a lifeline, a way to keep the mind engaged and awake. And they shared water, and they shared food, and they watched out for one another. A man who stumbled was helped up. A man who fell behind was urged on, or carried for a time on a cart. The march was a collective effort, a shared burden. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but entirely believable, of a knight who was so exhausted on a march that he began to hallucinate. He saw fields of green, pools of cool water, the face of his wife. He spoke to people who were not there. His companions grew concerned, but they did not stop. They kept him moving, walking beside him, talking to him, keeping him tethered to reality by the thread of their voices. They did not have medical knowledge, but they had the simple human knowledge that motion is life, that to stop is to surrender. And that is how they survived, by not stopping, by taking one more step and then another, and then another, until the sun went down and they could rest, and then doing it all again the next day. The knights who made it through the heat, the disease, and the sleepless marches were not necessarily the strongest or the bravest. They were the most stubborn, the most adaptable, the ones who could sleep in the saddle, who could drink warm, foul water without retching, who could wrap their heads in cloth and keep their eyes on the horizon. They were human, with all the fragility that implies, but they had something else, a quiet, unthinking resilience. They did not think of themselves as surviving. They simply did what had to be done. They put one foot in front of the other. They endured. And so, as we settle deeper into our own quiet, comfortable place, let us remember them, not as heroes in shining armor, but as tired men, dusty and hot, walking under a foreign sun. Let us feel the weight of their world for a moment, the slow, heavy rhythm of their days. And let us be grateful for our own soft blankets, our own cool water, our own quiet nights. But also, let us carry a small piece of their patience with us. That ability to keep moving, to keep enduring, even when the path seems endless. Because that, in its simplest form, is the story of survival. And we have only just begun to walk that path together. We will go a little further in a little while. But for now, let the image of that dusty column of men, moving slowly under a pale sky, settle into your mind. Let it fade like a distant memory, and rest. And so, as the image of that dusty column fades into the quiet of your mind, you might find yourself wondering what happened when they finally stopped, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the order came to make camp. What did a knight do with those few precious hours of darkness? The march had demanded everything from him, every drop of sweat, every ounce of attention, every shred of will. But the night was not simply a time for rest. It was a time for maintenance, for preparation, for the small rituals that kept a man alive in a land that seemed to want him dead. The first task always was water. The knights would seek out a source, a stream or a well, and they would fill their leather bottles and their wooden buckets. If the water was muddy, they let it sit, letting the sediment settle to the bottom. If it was scarce, they rationed it, each man receiving a measured amount. They would drink slowly, knowing that to gulp was to invite cramps, and then they would water their horses. The horses, the great destriers and the pack ponies, were as vital as any man. Without them, a knight was just a man in heavy armor, slow and vulnerable. So the horses were tended first, their backs checked for sores from the saddle, their hooves cleaned of stones, their feed given out from the dwindling sacks of grain. There was a tenderness in the way the knights touched their horses, a quiet understanding between living creatures who had walked the same long road. Then came food. The Crusader diet was simple, monotonous. Hard bread, called biscuit, that could be soaked in water or wine to make it edible. Dried meat, salted and tough, that had to be chewed for a long time before it could be swallowed. Lentils and beans, boiled into a thick porridge. Sometimes, if they were lucky, there was cheese, or a little oil, or a handful of dates bought from a local merchant. The knights ate without ceremony, sitting on the ground, their armor loosened but not removed. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation, listening to the sounds of the camp, the crackle of fires, the low murmur of prayers, the distant bark of a dog from a nearby village. It was a simple existence, stripped of the comforts of home. No soft beds, no warm halls, no roasted meats, just the bare necessities and the knowledge that tomorrow would be much the same. But even in this simplicity, there were moments of grace. A knight might find a scrap of wild thyme growing near the camp and crush it between his fingers, breathing in the familiar scent of his garden at home. He might see a bird he recognized, a lark or a swallow, and feel a small connection to a world beyond the dust and the heat. He might share a story with a companion, a memory of a winter evening by the fire, of a girl with braided hair, of a hunt in the forests of his youth. These memories were not escapes. They were reminders of why he had come, of what he was fighting for. They were fragile things, easily shattered by the reality of the march, but they were necessary. Without them, a man could lose his way entirely. And then there was the armor. The armor that had protected him in battle was a burden in camp. It was hot, it was heavy, and it had to be cleaned and maintained. Rust was a constant enemy. A knight would spend an hour each evening, if he could, wiping down his hauberk with a rag, oiling the joints of his helm, checking the rivets on his shield. This work was meditative, a way to keep his hands busy while his mind drifted. He would run his fingers over the dents and scratches, each one a memory of a blow taken. He would remember the battle, the shock of impact, the grunt of his enemy, and he would prepare himself for the next one, because there would always be a next one. The nights were not always quiet. Sometimes there were alarms, a cry from a sentry, a sudden movement in the darkness, the thud of an arrow striking a tent. The knights would scramble to their feet, grabbing their weapons, their hearts pounding. They would form up, shields raised, eyes straining into the black. But often the alarm was false. A stray animal, a nervous sentry, a trick of the wind. The tension would slowly ease, and the men would return to their bedrolls, their sleep broken, their nerves frayed. The fear of attack was a constant presence, a shadow that never fully lifted. It wore on them as surely as the heat and the disease. To cope with this fear, the knights found their own ways. Some prayed, reciting the words of the Psalms over and over until they felt a calm settle over them. Some drank a little wine or beer, not enough to dull the senses, but enough to take the edge off. Some simply talked, sharing their fears and their hopes in the quiet of the night. They spoke of home, of the families they had left behind, of the saints they prayed to. They spoke of the holy city, the goal of their journey, and of what it would feel like to finally see its walls. These conversations were a kind of medicine, a balm for the weary soul. They reminded the knights that they were not alone, that they were part of something larger than themselves. And then, too soon, the dawn would come. The first light would creep over the horizon, gray at first, then pink, then gold. The camp would stir to life. Fires were rekindled, the last of the bread was eaten, the horses were saddled. The knights would don their armor again, the familiar weight settling onto their shoulders. They would check their weapons, their water bottles, their packs. And then they would form up, the columns stretching out once more, ready to march. The same road, the same sun, the same dust. But each day was different in its own small way. A new landscape, a new challenge, a new story to tell. Let us walk with them for a while in our imagination. Let us feel the sun on our backs, the dust in our throats. Let us hear the creak of leather and the jingle of bridles. Let us see the line of men stretching ahead and behind, a living ribbon moving across the earth. And let us notice the small things, the way a knight adjusts his helmet when the glare becomes too bright, the way he shares a sip of water with a man who has run dry, the way he hums a tune, a song from his childhood, to keep himself awake. These small acts are the fabric of survival. They are not heroic in the grand sense. They are simply human, and that is what makes them worth remembering. There is a particular story that comes to mind, one that speaks to the strange endurance of these men. It is said that during the siege of Antioch, a group of knights were assigned to guard a section of the wall through the night. They were exhausted, having fought all day, and the night was cold and damp. They stood in the shadows, their spears in hand, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the ramparts. Time seemed to stretch. The hours crawled by. One of the knights, a young man from a northern county, began to nod off. His head drooped, his grip on his spear loosened. The knight beside him, an older man, reached out and gently touched his shoulder. The young man started, embarrassed. The older man said nothing, only smiled, and went back to watching. They stood together in silence for the rest of the watch. And when dawn came and the siege continued, the young knight remembered that touch, that small act of kindness. It was not much, but it was enough to keep him going, to keep him awake, to keep him alive. These are the moments that history often overlooks. The great battles, the famous leaders, the dramatic turning points, those are the things we remember. But the real story of survival is written in the small, quiet decisions. The decision to share water. The decision to stay awake for one more hour. The decision to help a fallen comrade. The decision to keep walking, even when every muscle screams for rest. The Crusader knights were not superhuman. They were not immune to fear or fatigue. They were, in many ways, just like us. They had hopes and fears, loves and losses. They had bodies that ached and minds that wandered. And yet, they endured. They endured because they had to, because there was no other choice, because the road ahead was the only road they could take. So as we drift further into this story, let us not romanticize them too much. Let us see them clearly, in all their frailty. Let us see the blisters on their feet, the sunburn on their necks, the hollows under their eyes. Let us see them as they were, tired, thirsty, lonely, scared. And let us admire not their glory, but their stubbornness. That quiet, unspectacular stubbornness that carried them through heat and disease and sleeplessness. It is a quality that we all have somewhere deep inside. And perhaps, by listening to their story, we can find it in ourselves. Now, let us turn our attention to another aspect of their survival. way they navigated the landscape. The land of the Levant was not familiar to them. It was a land of steep hills and narrow valleys, of rocky ravines and dry riverbeds. It was a land where water was hidden, where the paths were uncertain, where a wrong turn could lead to disaster. The knights relied on local guides, sometimes willing, sometimes coerced. They followed ancient roads built by Romans and Greeks that were still in use. They used the stars and the position of the sun and the direction of the wind. They marked their progress by landmarks, a distinctive mountain, a ruined tower, a grove of olive trees. And they learned, slowly, to read the land, to see where water might be found by the presence of certain plants, to see where an ambush might be set by the shape of the terrain. They became, in their own way, students of the earth. This knowledge was hard won. There were times when they marched for days without finding a reliable source of water. There were times when they lost the path and had to backtrack, wasting precious time and energy. There were times when they were forced to cross a desert, a vast expanse of sand and rock that seemed to go on forever. In those places, the heat was a solid thing, a weight that pressed down on them. The air shimmered with mirages, pools of water that vanished as they approached. The knights learned to ignore these visions, to keep their eyes on the ground, to focus on the next step. They learned to ration their water carefully, to drink only when necessary, to let a few drops linger on their tongues before swallowing. They learned to march at night when the air was cooler, and to rest during the heat of the day, huddled under whatever shade they could find. There is a particular memory that comes to me of a march through the region of the Dead Sea. The knights were heading south toward the city of Kerak. The landscape was barren, a desolation of salt and stone. The sun beat down without mercy. The men were silent, their heads bowed, their feet dragging. The horses stumbled. The pack animals brayed in protest. The dust rose in clouds, coating everything in a fine gray powder. It seemed as though the earth itself was trying to swallow them. And yet, they kept moving. They kept moving because there was no other option. To stop was to die. And so they put one foot in front of the other, for hours, for days, until they reached the walls of Kerak and the promise of water and shade. In that moment, when they finally saw the city, there was no cheering. There was only a quiet, profound relief. They dismounted, their legs trembling. They walked to the well and they drank. They drank until their bellies were full, and then they sat down and they rested. They did not speak of the march. They did not need to. They had all shared the same experience, and words would only diminish it. They simply sat in the cool of the evening and let the exhaustion wash over them. And then, after a while, they began to prepare for the next day, because that is what survivors do. They rest, and then they move on. We too can rest now for a moment. Let the image of that city, with its high walls and its shaded courtyards, settle into your mind. Let the cool water be a comfort. Let the silence be a gift. And when you are ready, we will walk a little further into the next chapter of this long, slow story. But for now, let the story hold you like a gentle hand on a tired shoulder. Let it carry you softly into the quiet of the night. And so we rest, for a while, in the shadow of those walls. The nights have found their water, their shade, their brief reprieve. But the body, you see, does not forget its journey so easily. The heat, the dust, the sleepless nights, they leave their marks. And soon enough, the small aches and pains that were pushed aside during the march begin to surface. A twinge in the knee, a burn in the throat, a heaviness in the chest. The Crusader knights were not strangers to illness. They carried it with them, like an unwanted companion, from one camp to the next. And in the crowded quarters of a siege or a garrison, disease could spread as swiftly as a whisper through a silent hall. Let us speak now of sickness, of the invisible enemy that haunted every step of their journey. For the Crusaders, disease was a constant, a shadow that followed them across the sea. They called it by many names: the pestilence, the fever, the flux, and each name carried its own flavor of dread. There was the dysentery that came from bad water or spoiled food, a bloody, draining illness that left a man too weak to stand. There was the malaria that rose from the marshes, bringing with it waves of chills and burning heat that made the bones ache and the mind wander. There was the typhus, carried by lice and fleas, that brought a rash and a fever that could steal a man's wits before it took his life. And then there were the unnamed fevers, the mysterious illnesses that seemed to come from the very air itself, as if the land were breathing its displeasure onto the invaders. The knights were not ignorant of these dangers. They had their own remedies, passed down through generations, learned from the monks and the healers of their home villages. They carried pouches of dried herbs, sage and rosemary and thyme, to be brewed into teas that might soothe a fever. They knew that rest and warmth could help a man recover, and that clean water was precious beyond measure. But the knowledge of the time was limited and often mistaken. They might bleed a man to release bad humors, or apply poultices of mud and vinegar to a wound, hoping to draw out the poison. They prayed, and they prayed again, and they trusted in God to guide the hands of the physicians. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes a man recovered, but often it did not. There is a story, told in the chronicles of the First Crusade, of a knight who fell ill during the long march across Anatolia. He was a young man, strong and eager, but the heat and the lack of water had worn him down. He developed a fever that came and went, a fever that left him shivering in the midday sun. His companions did not abandon him. They took turns carrying his pack, sharing their own meager supplies of water. They built a litter from branches and cloaks, and they carried him between them, mile after mile, over rocky hills and through dry valleys. The sick knight drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering in his sleep, sometimes crying out for his mother. And yet the column did not leave him behind. They held him close, as if he were a brother, because in that world he was. For days they carried him. For days his fever raged. And then one morning, as they were preparing to break camp, the young knight opened his eyes. He looked up at the sky, clear and blue, and he asked for water. His companions gave him a sip, and then another. And slowly, as the sun rose higher, his fever broke. He was weak, terribly weak, but he was alive. He could not walk, not yet, but he could speak, and he could smile. And his companions, they did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply nodded and helped him to his feet and supported him as he took his first trembling steps. They had saved him, not with medicine, not with prayer alone, but with stubborn, quiet perseverance, with the simple refusal to let a man die. That is the kind of survival that is rarely recorded in the grand histories. It is the survival that happens in the margins, in the small hours, in the face of a fever that cannot be fought with a sword. The knights learned to care for each other, not because they were saints, but because they were practical. A dead man could not fight. A sick man could not march. And so they developed a kind of communal hygiene, a set of unwritten rules. They learned to dig latrines away from the camp, to boil water when they could, to avoid the swamps and the stagnant pools. They learned to recognize the first signs of illness, a glazed eye, a stumble, a lack of appetite, and they would pull that man aside, give him extra rest, force him to drink. They were not doctors, but they were observers. And in a world where a single outbreak could decimate an army, observation was a kind of medicine. There is a curious detail, one that might bring a small smile to your lips. The knights were known to use garlic, of all things, as a preventative. They believed that eating raw garlic could ward off disease, and they were partly right. Garlic has natural antimicrobial properties, though they did not know the science. They simply trusted the old wisdom, the lore of the countryside, and they tucked cloves of garlic into their packs, alongside their dried meat and hard bread. They would chew it slowly, the pungent flavor filling their mouths, and they would hope that it kept the sickness at bay. Imagine a column of knights marching under the hot sun, their breath heavy with garlic, their armor clanking, and the air around them thick with the smell. It is not a heroic image, perhaps, but it is a human one. They did what they could with what they had. And there is more, a softer kind of remedy. The knights carried with them small relics, pieces of cloth or bone or wood, blessed by a priest, believed to hold the power of saints. They would touch these relics when they felt ill, press them to their foreheads, whisper a prayer. It was a comfort, a way of reaching for something beyond the physical. In the long nights of fever, when the body burned and the mind wandered, that small object, a fragment of something holy, could be an anchor. It could remind a man that he was not alone, that there was a presence watching over him, even in the depths of his suffering. Whether the relics actually healed anyone is a question for historians and theologians, but they gave hope. And hope, in the grip of disease, is sometimes the only medicine that works. We can think of this as we settle deeper into our own quiet evening. The knights, with their garlic and their relics, their herbal teas and their prayers, they were not so different from us. They sought comfort where they could find it. They held onto habits and rituals, small routines that made the chaos of their world a little more predictable. And when sickness came, as it always did, they leaned on each other. They carried the sick. They shared their remedies. They kept watch through the night. They understood, in a way that is easy to forget, that survival is not an individual act. It is a collective one. It is the hand that reaches out, the water that is shared, the vigil that is kept. Let us move now gently to the matter of sleep, or rather the lack of it. For the sleepless marches were not merely a matter of fatigue, but a test of the will. The knights had to march for days, sometimes weeks, with only a few hours of rest. They had to stand watch through the night, and then fight when the sun rose. Their bodies screamed for rest, but the march did not pause. They learned to sleep in the saddle or on their feet, leaning against a comrade or a tree. They learned to snatch moments of rest in the heat of the day, when the sun was too fierce to move. And they learned to push through the fog of exhaustion, to keep their eyes open even when the world blurred. One technique they used was to walk in rhythm, a steady pace that matched the beat of a song or the clank of armor. The repetition helped to keep the mind occupied, to lull it into a kind of trance. They would sing, low and tuneless, the ballads of their homes. They would tell stories, passing them down the line, each man adding a detail. They would count steps, or recite prayers, or simply focus on the back of the man in front. The body could be trained, they found, to move even when the mind was dull. It was like a machine, oiled by habit, that could continue to function long after the spirit had retreated into a quiet corner. There is a particular memory, preserved in the writings of a chaplain who accompanied the Third Crusade. He describes a night march through a narrow valley, under a moonless sky. The knights were exhausted, having fought a skirmish the previous afternoon. They had no campfires, for fear of revealing their position. They moved in near darkness, guided only by the stars and the whispers of their scouts. The chaplain writes that he could hear men stumbling, their armor clinking, their breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, out of the darkness, there came a soft voice singing a lullaby. It was a strange sound, a song meant for children drifting through the night. The chaplain asked the man beside him who was singing. The man shrugged. It did not matter. The lullaby was a comfort, a thread of home in the blackness. And the column continued to move, step by step, guided by that small, fragile melody. That is the kind of detail that stays with you. The knights were not machines. They were men who had been children once, who had been sung to by their mothers, who had known the safety of a warm bed. And on that dark march in a foreign land, under a sky full of strange stars, one of them reached back into that memory and pulled out a song. He sang it to keep himself awake, to remind himself that he was still human. And in doing so, he gave comfort to the others, a tiny gift that cost nothing and meant everything. So let us, too, find our own small rhythms. Let us breathe slowly, in and out, and let the story carry us forward. The Crusader knights survived because they adapted, because they learned to treat illness with whatever they had, and because they refused to let each other fall. They endured the sleepless marches by turning their minds to simpler things, to songs and stories, and the steady beat of their own feet. They were not heroes in the way we often imagine, with shining armor and grand gestures. They were tired, dirty, hungry, and scared. And they kept going. Now let us consider the role of the horses. For the knights, their horses were more than transportation. They were partners, companions, a vital part of their survival. The horses suffered as much as the men, from the heat, from the lack of water, from the long marches. The knights cared for them as best they could, sharing their own water, finding fodder where they could. They slept beside their horses, using them as warmth on cold nights. They would whisper to them, calm them, tend to their wounds. The bond between a knight and his horse was deep, almost sacred. And when a horse died, it was a loss that cut deeper than the loss of equipment. It was the loss of a friend. There is a story from the Siege of Acre. A knight's horse had been wounded by an arrow, a deep wound in the flank. The knight could have put the horse down, could have taken another from the supply. But he did not. He stayed up through the night, cleaning the wound, applying a poultice of herbs, holding a cloth against the bleeding. The horse trembled and whickered, and the knight talked to it, soft words in his native tongue. By morning, the horse was still alive, and the wound had stopped bleeding. The knight rode that horse for the rest of the campaign. It seems a small thing, perhaps, but it speaks to the patience and the gentleness that existed alongside the violence. These men were capable of great tenderness, even when they were weary beyond measure. And so we drift from one scene to another, like a slow river carrying us through the landscape of memory. We have seen the knights in the heat, in the sickness, in the sleepless nights. We have seen them through the eyes of their companions and their chroniclers. And we have begun to understand that survival is not a single act, but a collection of small choices. It is the choice to help a fallen comrade, to share a sip of water, to sing a lullaby in the dark. It is the choice to keep trusting, to keep hoping, to keep walking, even when every part of you wants to stop. Let us pause here for a long moment and let these images settle. The dust, the garlic, the lullaby, the trembling horse. The hands that held a cloth against a wound, the eyes that watched for fever, the lips that whispered a prayer. This is the fabric of their days, and it is a fabric that we can hold gently in our own minds as we continue through the night. The story is not yet finished. There are more steps to take, more roads to follow. But for now, let the quiet hold us. Let the memory of those weary nights be a soft lantern in the darkness. And when you are ready, we will walk again. And so we do walk, gently, into the next stretch of the story. The night is still around us, and the lantern of memory flickers softly. Let us turn our attention now to something that may seem ordinary, but was in fact a matter of life and death: the search for water. In the heat of the Levant, under a sun that seemed to hang forever in the sky, water was not merely a comfort. It was the difference between a march and a collapse. The knights learned to read the land, to find the hidden springs and the shallow wells that the locals knew. They watched where the birds gathered at dawn, and they followed the dry riverbeds to their sources. Sometimes they found water that was brackish, heavy with minerals, and it made them sick. But they drank it anyway, because the thirst was a greater tyrant than any illness. There is a passage in the chronicle of a French knight, a man who had traveled from the green valleys of his homeland to the dusty hills of Palestine. He writes, with a kind of wonder, about the first time he saw a Bedouin draw water from a well with a goatskin bucket. The night had been staggering, his throat raw, his lips cracked. He watched as the Bedouin lowered the bucket, pulled it up, and offered him a drink. The water was warm, and it tasted of leather and earth. But to the knight, it was the most precious thing he had ever held. He drank slowly, feeling the liquid spread through him like a blessing. And he realized, in that moment, that survival is often a matter of trust. You have to trust the stranger who offers you water. You have to trust that the well is not poisoned, that the hand is not a trap. And sometimes, you simply have to trust that the next spring will appear before you collapse. The knights carried water skins, of course, but they were never enough. A full skin could weigh 30 pounds or more, and it was a burden that had to be shared among the horses and the men. They learned to ration, to take small sips rather than gulps. They learned to wet their lips and their tongues and let the moisture linger. They learned to chew on a pebble or a piece of leather to stimulate saliva. And they learned to march in the cooler hours of the early morning and the late evening, conserving their sweat. Sometimes, when the sun was at its peak, they would halt and find what shade they could under a scraggly tree or in the shadow of a cliff. They would lie still, barely moving, and wait for the heat to pass. It was a form of surrender, an acknowledgement that the body has limits that cannot be pushed. And with the water came the problem of disease. For water that looks clear can carry the seeds of sickness. The knights knew this in a vague way from their experiences at home. But in the East, the water was different. It carried unfamiliar microbes, and their bodies had no resistance. Dysentery was a constant companion, a scourge that could fell a strong man in a day. The knights learned to boil water when they could, but fuel was scarce in the treeless plains. They learned to add wine or vinegar, hoping that the acidity would kill the worst of the contagion. They learned to filter water through cloth or through sand, though they did not understand why it helped. They simply knew that those who were careful, who took the time to prepare their water, were more likely to survive. One of the most curious remedies, recorded in a manuscript from the late 12th century, was the use of a specific kind of clay. The knights would mix a small amount of this clay with water, let it settle, and then drink the clear liquid that remained. The clay, it was thought, could bind to the impurities and draw them out. It was a practice they had learned from the local inhabitants, who had used it for generations. And though the knights did not know the word for it, they were engaging in a primitive form of water purification. The clay was often found near certain springs, and the knights would carry small pouches of it, like talismans. They would add a pinch to their water skins, shake them gently, and wait. Then they would drink, trusting that the earth itself had given them a gift. We can imagine, perhaps, a knight sitting by a small fire at dusk, his water skin in his hands. He is tired, his bones ache, and the day has been long. He pours a little water into a cup, adds a pinch of clay, and stirs. The firelight catches the surface, and he watches the particles settle. He takes a sip. The water is cool now, and it tastes of stone. He closes his eyes and lets the relief wash over him. This is not a dramatic moment. It is not a battle or a victory, but it is a moment of survival. And there are thousands of such moments, woven together like threads in a tapestry, that form the story of how these men endured. Let us move now, slowly, to the question of food. For the knights could not march on water alone. They needed sustenance, and the land they passed through was often barren or hostile. They carried dried meat, hardtack, and beans. They carried cheese that was so hard it had to be grated. They carried olive oil and vinegar, and sometimes a little honey. When they could, they traded with the locals, exchanging goods they had brought from Europe for fresh fruit and vegetables. But trade was unpredictable, and often the knights went hungry. They learned to eat things they would never have considered at home. Locusts, roasted over a fire, wild herbs that were bitter but nourishing, the marrow from the bones of their own horses when a horse died. They learned to be grateful for a handful of dates or a piece of stale bread. There is a story, passed down in the camp songs of the Third Crusade, about a group of knights who found a patch of wild onions. They had been marching for 3 days with little more than water and a few biscuits. The onions were small and pungent, and they made the men's eyes water. But they ate them eagerly, pulling them from the dry soil, rubbing off the dirt, and chewing them raw. One of the knights, a man who had been a cook in his youth, gathered the leaves and made a broth. He added a little salt and a handful of lentils, and he boiled it all in a pot he had carried from home. The men gathered around, dipping their bread into the broth, and for a little while they felt full. It was a small feast, a moment of shared warmth in a landscape that offered little comfort. And so the knights learned to pay attention to the land, to notice the small things that could sustain them. They learned which berries were safe, which roots could be boiled, which leaves could be chewed to stave off hunger. They learned to hunt when game was available, using their bows and their dogs. They learned to fish in the rivers and the coastal waters, using nets they had woven from rope. And they learned to share, to pool their resources, because a single knight could not carry enough for a long campaign. The camp became a kind of cooperative, where food was distributed according to need, and where a hungry man was never turned away. Let us pause now and consider the role of the camp itself. The Crusader camp was not a permanent settlement, but it was a home of sorts. It was a collection of tents and shelters, arranged in a defensive circle, with the horses and the supplies in the center. There were cooks and blacksmiths, tailors and priests, men and women who followed the army for various reasons. The camp had its own rhythm, its own sounds and smells. The smell of wood smoke and cooking, of horses and leather, of sweat and dust. The sounds of hammering and talking, of prayer and laughter, of snoring and coughing. It was a living thing, a small city that moved across the land. In the evenings, after the day's march, the knights would gather around the fires. They would take off their armor piece by piece and rub the sweat and grit from their skin. They would check their weapons, sharpen their swords, and repair their gear. They would tend to their horses, feeding them and watering them, checking their hooves for stones. And then they would sit and they would talk. They would talk about their homes, about the cold winters and the green fields. They would talk about the women they had left behind and the children they hoped to see again. They would tell jokes, some of them crude, and they would sing songs, some of them sad. And in these quiet moments, they were reminded of what they were fighting for. They were not just soldiers. They were husbands, fathers, sons. They were men with memories and hopes. One night, a German by birth used to carve small figures from wood. He would sit by the fire, his knife moving slowly, and he would shape a little horse or a bird. He gave them to his comrades, who would tuck them into their pouches, carrying a piece of his craft with them. He said it reminded him of his father, who had been a woodworker. He said that carving helped him to keep his hands steady and his mind calm. And so the camp had its artists, its dreamers, its men who held onto a fragile thread of beauty in the midst of hardship. Now, we must also consider the matter of sleep. We have spoken of the sleepless marches, but there were also the sleepless nights in camp. The knights had to stand watch, 4 hours at a time, in the darkness. They had to listen for the sound of approaching enemies, for the crack of a twig, or the whisper of a scout. They had to keep the fires burning low, so that they would not be seen from a distance. And they had to fight the urge to close their eyes, to let their heads nod. The fear of an attack was a constant companion, and it kept them alert, but it also drained them. They learned to sleep in short bursts, to take naps when they could, to rest their minds even if their bodies could not rest fully. There was a technique described in a military manual of the era that advised knights to sleep sitting up, with their backs against a tree or a rock. This position, it was said, allowed them to fall into a light sleep from which they could be roused quickly. They would place their weapons within reach, and they would keep their feet free of their boots so that they could stand quickly. They would sleep in their armor, or at least in their gambeson, so that they did not have to waste time dressing. It was uncomfortable, but it was practical. And over time, they grew accustomed to it, as soldiers always do. Let us pause here for a breath, a gentle sigh. The camp is quiet now. The fires have died down, and the stars are scattered across the sky like grains of salt. Are with the knights, sharing their vigil. We feel the weight of the day, the ache in our own legs, the dry taste in our mouths. And we understand, in a small way, what it means to keep going. The story continues, but for now, let the silence wrap around us. Let the memory of those weary men be a soft pillow for our thoughts. And when you are ready, we will walk again, through the heat and the dust, toward the distant walls of Jerusalem. Now, let us rise with the knights as the first light of dawn touches the horizon. The air is still cool, but already the heat is gathering, waiting to press down upon them. They have slept little, but they have slept enough to go on. They eat a small breakfast, a piece of bread, and a sip of water, and they prepare to march. The horses are saddled, the tents are folded, and the camp is dismantled. It is a slow, methodical process, each man knowing his task, each movement learned through repetition. There is no hurry, for hurry wastes energy, and energy is precious. They move like a great animal, stirring and stretching before it begins its journey. The march itself is a kind of meditation. The nights fall into a rhythm, one foot after the other, the dust rising around them. They do not speak much, for speech requires breath, and breath is valuable in the heat. They save their words for the evening. Instead, they listen to the sounds of the march, the creak of leather, the jingle of harness, the soft thud of hooves. They watch the land change around them, from rocky hills to dry plains to narrow valleys. They notice the birds, the lizards, the occasional hare that darts across the path. They notice the clouds, if there are any, and they pray for rain. But rain is rare, and the sun is relentless. There's a story told by a chronicler who traveled with the army of Richard the Lionheart about a knight who fell asleep on his horse. He was so tired that his head nodded forward, and his hands went slack on the reins. His horse, a steady old mare, kept walking, following the horse ahead. The knight slept for perhaps an hour, swaying gently in the saddle, while the sun climbed higher and the dust settled on his face. When he woke, he did not know where he was. He looked around, disoriented, and then he saw the familiar banner of his company ahead. He smiled, shook his head, and kept going. It was a small thing, but it speaks to the bone-deep exhaustion that these men carried with them, a weariness that became as natural as breathing. And so they marched, day after day, through landscapes that blurred together. They learned to read the land, to find water in places where none seemed to exist. They learned to follow the dry riverbeds, the wadis, because water often flowed beneath the surface. They learned to look for green plants, for patches of grass, because they indicated moisture. They learned to dig shallow wells, scraping away the dry topsoil until they reached damp sand, and then waiting for the water to seep in. It was slow work, but it was life-giving. And when they found a spring or a stream, they stopped and refilled their skins, and they let the horses drink, and they rested in the shade of rocks or trees, if any could be found. Let us think now about the horses, for they were as important as the men themselves. A night without a horse was not a night, at least not in the way they understood it. The horses carried them, but they also carried their supplies, their weapons, their hopes. The horses suffered in the heat too. They developed sores from the saddles, and their hooves cracked in the dry soil. The knights learned to care for them, to check their feet every evening, to apply ointment made from tallow and herbs to their wounds. They learned to ration the horses water, giving them just enough to keep them going, but not so much that they would founder. They learned to share their own water with their horses when the animals were too weak to go on. There are records of knights weeping over a dying horse, not because of the loss of a possession, but because of the loss of a companion. Now, let us turn to the matter of disease, for it was a constant shadow. The knights were not scientists, but they were observers. They noticed that certain places seemed to bring sickness, especially low-lying areas where water pooled. They noticed that illness often followed the consumption of certain foods or water from certain sources. They did not understand germs, but they understood cause and effect. And so they developed their own remedies, passed down from generation to generation. They used garlic and vinegar, believing that they cleansed the blood. They used honey on wounds, and they used wine as a disinfectant. They used herbs like sage and thyme, steeped in hot water to ease fevers. They used willow bark, which we now know contains salicylic acid, to reduce pain. It was not perfect, but it was something. There is a story from a hospital established by the Knights of St. John about a knight who fell ill with a fever. He was burning, his skin hot to the touch, and he had been vomiting for 2 days. The hospitalers gave him a drink made from willow bark and honey, and they placed cool cloths on his forehead. They let him rest in a quiet room, away from the noise and the dust. They fed him small amounts of broth, made from chicken and herbs. And slowly, over the course of a week, he recovered. He was weak, and he would never be quite as strong as before, but he survived. The hospitalers recorded his case, noting the treatment that had worked. And so knowledge was passed forward from one campaign to the next, from one generation to the next. We must also speak of the mind, for the knights faced not only physical trials, but mental ones. The long marches, the monotony, the constant uncertainty, these things wore on their spirits. They missed their homes, their families, the familiar rhythms of their lives. They wondered if they would ever see those things again. Some fell into despair, sitting by the fire with empty eyes, unable to speak. Others found solace in prayer, in the rituals of their faith. They attended Mass when they could, and they carried rosaries and relics. They believed that God was with them, that their suffering had meaning. This belief gave them strength, but it also gave them hope. And hope, perhaps more than any other thing, kept them alive. There is a letter written by a knight to his wife that has survived the centuries. In it, he describes his longing for her, his fear for their children, his doubts about the crusade. But he also writes of a dream he had, in which he saw a cross made of light, and he heard a voice saying that he would return. He writes that he clings to this dream, that he repeats it to himself when the darkness closes in. The letter is full of tenderness and sorrow, but it is also full of resolve. He signs it, "Your faithful husband, until the end of the world." This is not a story of glory. It is a story of a man trying to hold on to love across a vast and hostile land. And so the knights endured. They marched through heat and cold, through dust and mud, through hunger and thirst. They fought when they had to, and they rested when they could. They buried their dead, and they tended to the wounded. They learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment, to trust in their leaders and in each other. They learned that survival was not a single act, but 1,000 small acts, repeated day after day. They learned to find joy in a cool breeze, in a sip of clean water, in a laugh shared around a fire. They learned that the smallest things were often the most precious. Let us pause now and let the weight of these days settle upon us. We are walking with the knights, feeling the grit between our teeth, the ache in our shoulders, the heaviness of our feet. We are looking at the road ahead, which seems to stretch on forever. But we are also looking at the sky, which is vast and blue, and we are breathing. The world is quiet, except for the sound of our steps and the distant call of a bird. And in this moment, we are part of something larger than ourselves. We are part of a long journey, a story that has been told for centuries, a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And we are still walking, still moving forward, one step at a time, toward the distant walls of Jerusalem. We are still walking, still moving forward, one step at a time, toward the distant walls of Jerusalem. But those walls are not yet in sight. The land stretches out before them, a vast and empty sea of sand and stone. And the knights must learn to navigate this sea, not with a compass or a map, but with the wisdom of those who came before them. They learn to read the stars at night, to follow the track of the sun by day, to sense the direction of the prevailing wind. They learn to find their way by the feel of the ground beneath their feet, by the subtle changes in the color of the soil, by the presence of certain plants. It is a slow and careful art, and it is passed from one guide to the next, from one generation to the next. And the guides themselves are a curious lot. Some are native to the land, men who have lived in these deserts their whole lives. They are wiry and dark-skinned, with eyes that seem to see everything and nothing at once. They move with a quiet grace, their steps light on the hard ground. They know where the water is, where the shade is, where the enemy might be hiding. The knights trust them, but they do not fully understand them. There is a story told by a Crusader chronicler about a guide who led the army through a narrow canyon. The knights were nervous, for the walls rose high on either side, and they could be ambushed at any moment. But the guide walked calmly ahead, his hand on the reins of a small donkey. He did not look left or right. He simply walked, and the army followed. When they emerged from the canyon, the sun was setting, and they found a spring of fresh water. The guide smiled, and then he lay down and slept. The knights did not ask him how he knew the way. They simply thanked him, and they drank. There's also the matter of the camels. The knights brought their own horses, but they also used camels, borrowed or purchased from local traders. The camel is a strange and ungainly creature, with a long neck and a knobby hump. It smells bad, and it has a temper that can turn on you in an instant. But it can go days without water, and it can carry heavy loads across the hottest sand. The knights did not love the camels, but they learned to respect them. They learned to load them carefully, to speak to them in a low voice, to avoid startling them. They learned that a camel's bite is worse than a dog's, and its kick can break a man's leg. And yet, in those long marches, the camels were their lifeline. They carried the tents, the food, the water skins, the spare weapons. They carried the sick and the wounded when no other transport could be found. And they carried the bodies of the dead when it was not possible to bury them in the field. And speaking of the dead, we must talk about the rituals of burial. In a place where the ground is hard and the sun is fierce, burying a man is not always easy. The knights would dig shallow graves, scraping away the topsoil with their hands or with the pommels of their swords. They would wrap the body in a shroud, if one could be spared, and they would say a few prayers. They would mark the grave with a pile of stones or with a cross made from broken branches. And then they would move on. They did not have time for elaborate funerals. The dead were left behind in a land that would not remember them. But the knights remembered. They carried the names of their fallen friends in their hearts, and they whispered them at night under the stars. It was a way of keeping them alive, a way of honoring the bond they had forged in the heat and the dust. And yet, despite all the hardship, there were moments of unexpected beauty. A sunset that turned the sky to fire, a sudden rain that brought the scent of wet earth, a night so clear that the Milky Way seemed close enough to touch. The knights learned to appreciate these things, for there was so little beauty to be found. They would sit around the campfire, the flames casting long shadows on their tired faces, and they would speak of the gardens back home, of the green fields and the cool streams, of the women they loved and the children they had left behind. They would sing songs, old songs from their faraway villages, and the sound would drift out across the empty land, a lonely and beautiful sound. And for a moment, they would forget where they were. They would be home again in their memories, and the warmth of the fire would feel like the warmth of a hearth. There is a particular story from the Siege of Acre about a knight who played the lute. He was not a professional, just a man who had learned as a boy. But he carried his lute with him, strapped across his back, through all those months of marching. When the army camped, he would sit apart from the others, his back against a rock, and he would play. The music was soft and slow, and it seemed to carry a sadness that went beyond words. The other knights would gather around, not to speak, but to listen. And as they listened, their shoulders would relax and their eyes would grow distant. The music did not heal them, not in any physical way, but it reminded them that there was something beyond this place, something gentle and beautiful. It was a small thing, but in the midst of so much hardship, small things mattered. Now, let us turn our thoughts to the matter of sleep, or rather, the lack of it. The knights did not sleep well. The ground was hard, the nights were cold, and the threat of attack was always present. They slept in shifts, a portion of the army standing guard while the others rested. They slept in their armor, or at least with their weapons close at hand. They learned to sleep quickly, to take advantage of any moment of stillness. A knight might close his eyes for 10 minutes, then open them again, feeling as if he had slept for hours. It was a skill, like any other, and it was honed by necessity. There's a story from the army of Frederick Barbarossa about a knight who fell asleep while standing. He was on guard duty, and he had been awake for 2 days. He leaned against his spear, his head drooped, and he slept. He did not fall, because his body had learned to hold itself upright even in sleep. Another knight saw him and did not wake him. He simply took his place, standing beside him, keeping watch for them both. When the first knight woke, he did not know how long he had been asleep. He saw his companion standing there, silent and alert, and he nodded. No words were needed. It was a small act of kindness, born of shared exhaustion. And we must consider the heat, for it was a constant presence, a weight that pressed down on everything. The knights learned to move slowly, to conserve their energy. They learned to breathe through their noses, to keep their mouths closed so that they did not lose moisture. They learned to wrap their heads in cloth, leaving only a slit for their eyes. They learned to eat sparingly, for digestion itself was a drain on their strength. They learned to drink when there was water, even if they were not thirsty, because thirst came on quietly and suddenly. There is a story from the chronicles of the Third Crusade about a knight who refused to drink. He was a pious man, and he believed that water should be taken only when absolutely necessary, as a form of penance. His companions tried to convince him to drink, but he refused. He grew weaker and weaker, his lips cracking, his eyes becoming hollow. Finally, his commander ordered him to drink, and he obeyed. He took a single sip, and then another, and then he drank an entire skin of water. He sat in the shade, gasping, and he said, "I thought I was being holy. I was only being foolish." The chronicler notes that he learned his lesson, and that the next time they came to a spring, he drank without hesitation. So they learned day by day through trial and error. They learned that discipline was more important than courage, that patience was more important than strength. They learned that the smallest habits could make the difference between life and death. They learned to check their own feet for blisters, to clean their own weapons, to mend their own clothes. They learned to rely on each other, to share what they had, to offer comfort without words. And they learned to carry on, even when every fiber of their being cried out for rest. Let us think now of the camp followers, those who were not knights, but who traveled with the army. There were women, some of them wives, some of them camp followers in the usual sense. There were children, orphaned by previous battles, or simply born on the road. There were merchants, selling food and cloth and trinkets. There were priests, offering prayers and confession. There were surgeons, with their sharp knives and their crude remedies. These people formed a small world, moving slowly across the land. They were often overlooked by the chroniclers, but they were essential. They kept the army fed. They kept the morale up. They provided the small comforts that made the hardship bearable. There is a story about a woman named Matilda who traveled with the army of Richard the Lionheart. She was not a noblewoman, just a baker's wife from a village in England. She had followed her husband to the Holy Land, and when he died of fever, she did not turn back. She stayed with the army, baking bread from the coarse flour that was available. She would rise before dawn, build the fire, mix the dough, and shape the loaves. She would sell them to the knights, and they were grateful, for her bread was better than the hard biscuits they carried. She was known for her kindness, for giving a loaf to a hungry man who could not pay, for sharing her water when she had little. The knights called her the baker of the road, and they remembered her long after she was gone. She did not fight, and she did not lead, but she kept them alive, one loaf at a time. And so the army moved, a slow and dusty river of humanity. The landscape changed, but the rhythm remained the same. Up before dawn, a quick prayer, a piece of bread, a sip of water. Then the march, hour after hour, until the sun was high and the heat was unbearable. Then a halt, a rest in the shade of tents or rocks, a meal of dried meat and figs. Then another march, until the evening, when the air cooled and the stars began to appear. Then the camp, the fires, the stories, the sleep. And then another day and another. The knights learned to measure time not by the calendar, but by the position of the sun and the phases of the moon. They learned to recognize the constellations, to know that the appearance of Orion meant that winter was coming, that the rising of Sirius meant that the summer heat would soon peak. They learned to mark the passing of the seasons by the behavior of animals, the migration of birds, the blooming of desert flowers. And they learned that time moved differently in that land. A day could feel like a week, and a month could feel like a year. The journey seemed endless, and yet they knew that it would end one way or another. There is a passage in a letter from a knight to his brother, written during the 5th Crusade. He says, "We have been marching for so long that I have forgotten what it is like to stand still. My legs move without my telling them to. My eyes are always scanning the horizon. My mind is always half asleep, half alert. I have become a creature of the road, and I am not sure I remember how to be anything else." It is a strange confession, but it speaks to the transformation that took place in these men. They were no longer the knights who had left their homes, proud and eager. They were survivors, lean and hard, their bodies adapted to the harshness of the land. They had become part of the landscape as much as the rocks and the sand. And so we continue our own march through this story. We are not in the heat, not in the dust. We are lying in our beds, our heads on soft pillows, the blankets warm around us. But we can imagine, with our eyes closed, the feel of the hard ground beneath us, the weight of the armor on our shoulders, the taste of dust on our tongues. We can imagine the sound of the wind, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of voices. And in our imagination, we are there, walking with the knights, feeling the sun on our necks, smelling the sweat and the leather and the dry earth. It is a strange kind of travel, this journey through time and memory. But it is real in its own way. We are connected to those men through the stories they left behind, through the traces they carved into the world. We are part of the same long story, the story of human endurance, of the will to survive against all odds. And as we drift toward sleep, let us hold on to that connection. Let us feel the weight of their steps, the ache of their muscles, the hope that lived in their hearts. For their journey is our journey in its own quiet way. We are all marching through the heat and the cold, through the light and the dark, towards something that we may not fully understand. And we are not alone. And we are not alone. In the quiet of the camp, in the deep hours of the night, the knights found a kind of companionship that needed no words. They slept side by side, their bodies close for warmth against the cold desert air. They dreamed the same dreams of green fields and cool streams of home. And when one of them cried out in his sleep, his comrade would reach out and touch his shoulder, and the cry would stop. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. There was, among the knights of the hospital, a man named Hugh. He was not a great warrior, nor a leader of men. He was a quiet man, with a limp that had never fully healed from an old wound. He was often given the task of caring for the horses, for he had a gentle hand with them. He would rise before the others, even before the cooks, and go to the picket line. He would speak to the horses in a low voice, soothing them, checking their hooves, making sure their girths were not too tight. The horses knew him, and they would turn their heads to him, their nostrils fluttering with recognition. One evening, after a long march through a stretch of rocky terrain, Hugh found a horse that had gone lame. It was not one of the great destriers, but a pack horse, loaded with supplies. The animal stood trembling, favoring its left foreleg. Hugh knelt down, felt the leg, and found a stone lodged deep in the hoof. He removed it carefully, then cleaned the wound with water from his own canteen. He tore a strip from his own tunic and bound the hoof. The horse nuzzled him, and Hugh stroked its neck. He stayed with it through the night, sleeping beside it in the straw. In the morning, the horse was walking again, and Hugh was covered in straw and sweat, but he smiled. The other knights teased him for his tenderness, but they also respected it. They knew that a horse was more than a beast of burden. It was a companion, a partner in the long and weary road. And we must consider the role of these animals in the survival of the knights. The knights were heavy, encased in mail and plate, carrying sword and shield and lance. Without horses, they could not have moved at all. The horses carried them through the heat, through the dust, through the long hours when the men themselves were too exhausted to walk. The horses suffered too, their flanks caked with sweat, their mouths dry, their eyes sunken with fatigue. But they pressed on, because that was what they were trained to do. And the knights cared for them as best they could, often giving the horses the last of their water, or sharing their meager ration of grain. There is a story from the conquest of Cyprus during the Third Crusade. A knight named Stephen had a horse that had carried him for 3 years across Europe and into the Holy Land. The horse was a dapple gray, with a white blaze on its forehead. Stephen loved that horse, and he spoke to it as if it were a friend. One day, during a skirmish, the horse was struck by an arrow and fell. Stephen climbed off and saw the wound. He knew it was fatal. He knelt beside the horse, stroking its mane, and he sang to it a song from his childhood. The horse looked at him with its dark eyes, and then it closed them. Stephen did not leave until the horse had stopped breathing. He then took its bridle and its saddle, and he buried it in the sand. He marked the grave with a pile of stones. The other knights watched in silence. They understood, for each of them had lost a horse, and each of them had grieved. So the army moved, and the seasons turned. The heat of summer gave way to the chill of winter, and then back again. The knights grew accustomed to the rhythm of the desert, the sudden storms, the flash floods, the nights that were so clear the stars seemed to hang just above their heads. They learned to read the sky, to know when a storm was coming, to find shelter in the lee of a rock, to wait out the wind and the rain. They learned to build fires that gave off little smoke, for smoke could be seen from afar and attract unwanted attention. They learned to cook their food in the ground, in pits lined with hot stones, so that the smell did not travel far. And in the quiet of the night, they would sometimes hear the sound of singing. It was not the singing of the camp, the drunken songs of soldiers. It was the chanting of the monks who traveled with the army. The monks would gather in a circle, their voices rising in plain chant, the Latin words floating into the darkness. It was a strange and haunting sound, the same words that had been sung for centuries in the great cathedrals of Europe, now sung in the middle of a desolate plain under a million stars. The knights would lie on their bedrolls and listen, and the music would settle into their bones like a quiet prayer. There is a passage in the Chronicle of the Siege of Acre, written by a monk named Roger. He describes a night when the army was camped outside the city walls. The siege had been going on for months, and the men were tired and sick. The heat of the day had been unbearable, the flies thick, the stench of death from the battlefield hanging in the air. But at night, when the wind shifted, the air would cool and the stars would come out. The monks sang the Compline, the final prayer of the day, and the knights joined in, their rough voices blending with the clear tones of the monks. Roger writes that for a moment, the suffering seemed to lift, and the men were united not by war, but by the simple act of singing together in the dark. Let us stay with that image for a moment, a circle of voices rising into the night, the flicker of campfires, the glint of armor, the soft shuffle of horses shifting their weight. The air is cool, the sky deep and dark. The knights are not thinking of the next day, or of the enemy, or of the heat. They are thinking of nothing, just the sound of the chant, the presence of the men around them. It is a moment of peace, and it is precious because it is rare. And when the chant ends, they fall silent, and the only sound is the wind and the distant sound of the sea. That sea, the Mediterranean, was never far from the minds of the Crusaders. It was the sea that had brought them there, the sea that might take them home. They dreamed of it, of the cool green water, of the ships with their white sails. They would sometimes climb the highest hill they could find, hoping to catch a glimpse of the blue line on the horizon. And when they saw it, they would feel a strange mix of longing and comfort, as if the sea were a promise that all this would end someday. But the end was a long time coming. The knights learned to stop thinking about the end. They learned to live in the present, in the moment. They learned to take each day as it came, to find joy in small things. A cup of cold water, the shade of a tree, a kind word from a friend. They learned to appreciate the beauty of the land, the strange and rugged beauty of the rock and the sand, the way the light changed at sunset, the colors that painted the sky in shades of red and gold and purple. They learned that even in the harshest places, there is grace. And so we come to the end of our story, not with a great battle or a triumphant entry into Jerusalem, but with a quiet moment on the road. A knight is walking beside his horse, his hand resting on its neck. He is not thinking about glory. He is not thinking about God. He is thinking about the evening, about the camp that is just over the next ridge, about the fire that will soon be lit, about the bread that will be broken and shared. He is thinking about his friends, about the men who have walked beside him through the heat and the dust. He is thinking about how they are all still alive, and how that is a kind of miracle. He looks up at the sky, and he sees a single star, bright and steady, low on the horizon. It might be Venus, the evening star, or it might be something else. He does not know its name, but he takes it as a sign, a reminder that there is still light in the darkness. He walks on, his steps slow and steady, the dust rising in small puffs around his feet. And above him, the star shines, silent and constant. Now let us leave that night there on the road, under the star. Let us let him walk into the evening, into the quiet, into the long night that will end with the dawn. And we too will find our rest. The story is done for now. The heat and the dust and the long marches are just a memory, a tale told in the comfort of our own beds. We have walked with the Crusaders. We have felt the weight of their armor. We have known the ache of their bones. And now we return to ourselves, to the soft pillow, the warm blanket, the gentle rhythm of our own breathing. Let the story fade like the last embers of a campfire. Let the sound of the wind and the distant chant become soft, then softer, then silence. The nights are sleeping now in the camps of history, in the pages of books, in the quiet of our imagination. And we too will sleep. We will close our eyes, and we will walk with them, not on the dusty roads of the Holy Land, but in the dreamlands of our own minds, where the air is cool and the way is easy. Good night, then. Good night to the knights, to the horses, to the monks, to the bakers who fed them, to the surgeons who patched them, to all the forgotten souls who walked that long road. Good night to the heat and the cold, to the hunger and the thirst, to the weariness and the hope. And good night to you who have listened, who have traveled this path with us. May your sleep be deep and dreamless, or filled with gentle dreams. And may you wake refreshed, ready for your own journey, whatever it may be. The story ends here, not with a loud conclusion, but with a quiet breath. And so we let it go. We let it drift away, like a leaf on a slow river, into the current of the night. And we are left with the silence and the soft sound of our own heart beating steady, beating on. Sleep well.